to Mind Escape. Are you ready?
Are you ready to escape your mind?
Hello, Mind Escapees. If you have not already, please go check out my other channel, Masters of Rhetoric. I will have the link down below. It's also part of the Mind Escape LinkTree link. It's something I'm very passionate about, where I dissect the origins of Western thought through the pre-Socratic thinkers, all the way to Aristotle, and I'm probably going to go beyond that as well at some point. But right now I'm focused on the Ionian physicists all the way to Aristotle. So please support Masters of Rhetoric. Go check out our YouTube channel and subscribe. There's tons of shorts on there already, as well as episodes. And there's a bunch of episodes lined up. I'm on all audio platforms with it. And if you're on TikTok, Instagram, X, or any of the social media platforms, please go check out our page on there as well. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Tonight we have an amazing episode. Something a little different, a little out of my own wheelhouse, but I love that, and I love learning new things. I am joined by Dr. Richard Kaczynski, who is a psychologist, author, and historian of Western esotericism. He's the author of the book Perdurabo, which is the biography of Aleister Crowley. He recently re-released The Sword of Song with Inner Traditions, and he just released Mind Over Magick, which is available right now. So please go click the link down below and get yourself a copy. This is going to be a fascinating conversation on the intersection between mind and magic. Enjoy the show. All right, Richard, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you this fine evening?
Great. So anybody listening, this is Dr. Richard Kaczynski. He's an author of many books. One we're going to talk about tonight called Mind Over Magick. That's magic with a K. I thought that this would be a great conversation. And if you haven't checked it out already, please go check out Mind Over Magick, and shout out to Inner Traditions as well. And I will have the link down below all the way at the bottom if you are interested. So welcome on the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for that lovely introduction and for plugging Mind Over Magick.
Oh, of course. So just as a little bit of a background, how did you get into this field as like a historian of the occult and magic and things like that? Because like Mind Over Magick, kind of you get into like more of the psychological aspects of it. Do you think that there's anything to magic in terms of ritual magic, or where do you stand on that?
All right. Well, starting with the first part, how I got into this as a historian. I guess I came into this originally as someone who, from a very young age, was very interested in all this stuff. I just grew up at a time where this was it was in the air every place. There were magazines and books and TV programs and movies, game shows, and everything centered around this idea of what could probably be called the occult or metaphysics, UFOs, Bigfoot, ESP, magic, the unexplained, everything. And so I've always had that kind of interest, and later came specifically into contact with the Golden Dawn, which was a British initiatory mystical society, which then led to Aleister Crowley. And one day while I was traveling, I came across a new biography of Aleister Crowley that came out, and it was just terrible. And at this point I had been studying for about 10 years his works and other related things, and I just thought, man, this is so bad. I could do better a job than this. And so this little voice in the back of my head said, why don't you? And then I was off to the races. Then it was no longer like writing about or reading about this kind of from an interested observer or participant sort of thing, but now it's just like changing gears into writing about this in a more rigorous historical academic context. And for me, that was very important to talk about Aleister Crowley's life in the context of the times he lived, in the context of the people that he knew, which for me was also a great learning experience, because a lot of the people that Crowley knew were, Theodore Dreiser and folks like this were not folks that I actually had learned about myself, like in grade school or in college. So, I had to kind of enrich myself about that context as well. And it just kind of spilled out from there to kind of researching kind of the historical background of the whole esoteric milieu of the late 19th century, early 20th century occultism. And so from there, I wrote books like Forgotten Templars and the Origins of OTO. And recently, about last year, I put out a book about the foundations of Thelema, which primarily looking at Aleister Crowley and his colleagues Victor Neuberg and JFC Fuller, and how their approach to this new religious movement was informed by agnosticism, the culture of doubt, and how one would approach esotericism from that standpoint. So that's kind of my origin story as a historian of the occult and occult ideas and writing about that. But my interests in the occult, it also led me to pursue psychology as a degree when I went to university, thinking that A, that this would be a good career path for me, and B, that I was hopeful that I would find some answers to what is this stuff all about and how does it work. And I really didn't find those answers. There wasn't a psychology of magic or how all this worked at that time. Even though there were theoretical people like, Carl Jung was very popular. That was more like a theoretical model or perspective, but it wasn't really a testable theory in the empirical scientific sense. But kind of looking back on my career as a psychologist, or just the field, and my encounters with the literature over my professional life, I came to realize that while there isn't like a study where people are doing real-time imaging or anything like that on people who are dressed in their robes doing magical rituals, there are a lot of psychological studies on personality traits and characteristics and how we interact with the world that do in fact have bearing on what people do when they engage in ritual. And when I talk about people doing magic, I'm using a very broad term here, or broad definition. I'm not speaking specifically about, say, Golden Dawn ceremonial magicians, but any practitioner who in their spiritual works engages in some sort of a routine of spiritual practice. So that can include people who participate in witchcraft. It could be ceremonial magicians. It can be Freemasons. It can be pretty much any denomination if you're engaged in some sort of a regular spiritual practice. And I wanted to explore what psychology could tell us about that. And as to whether I believe in magic, I guess that's the last part of your question. So I'm sorry to be rambling on. I'm trying to remember all the things you asked me.
No, you're good. I should have parsed that out, but go ahead.
It kind of depends on your definition of magic and what you mean by magic. And one thing I'm very careful about with as a book is I don't try to address this question of how magic works in the broader sense. I think of, again, Aleister Crowley's definition of magic as the art and science of causing change to occur in a conformity with will. And so since there's two pieces to it, there's art and there's science, and I'm talking about the science part of it. There's still like an art to it as well. So I'm not trying to just chalk all this up to being mental gymnastics or it's all happening in your head. But I think there's something to be said for what is happening in your head, because we are human beings with minds existing in a world, and everything we do involves psychology to some extent or another. And my approach to this book is to say, here's the psychological factors that play a part in what happens when somebody does ritual. And beyond that, I leave that up to the reader to decide if they, my hope is that a skeptic could pick this up and read this book and say, okay, I can see why people feel there's a powerful effect from doing ritual. But I also kind of leave this book at the doorstep to that question. The idea that through these various practices, you can facilitate entering this liminal state of consciousness. And it's in that liminal state of consciousness that something called magic can happen. But I kind of stop at that threshold to say we can get into this liminal state of consciousness. But that said, there are lots of studies that support this idea that the practice of magic can be an effective tool for personal transformation. And that is one other definition of magic. The Golden Dawn, for instance, has this idea of we're doing high magic, as opposed to low magic, which is for like personal gain. The idea of high magic is that you're trying to improve yourself, become a better human being, become more spiritually aware, and again, go through this process of inner alchemy, of self-transformation. And in that sense, I think absolutely what we're talking about with the psychology of magic, that these tools that magicians use absolutely do facilitate putting people in that sort of a state where that transformation is possible.
Interesting. Yeah, and you said something in there about people not trying to create science or quantify the outcomes or something along those lines. I did read a book, I want to say like 7 years ago. I think it was Dean Radin, Real Magic, where he goes
I love Dean Radin.
Yeah. So it's like noetic sciences and things like that. What do you think about that, where it's like these very nominal changes is kind of like the idea behind that, or like a Rupert Sheldrake or somebody like that, where they're talking about things like somebody looking at the back of your head and you picking up on that, so you turn around or something along those lines. What do you think about that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I think I have like a two-part answer to that question. One is that in writing this book, I was trying to be very careful to stick to generally accepted peer-reviewed studies in psychology. And as I mentioned earlier, again, my hope is that even like a skeptic could read this and kind of go, okay, I see what you're saying. I can buy that. And I made a conscious decision to not go too deep into the ESP or psychical research. I do talk about it a little bit because I think the skeptical position poses some problems to talking about this. But by and large, I don't dive too deep into that as a subject. I figure there's people like Dean Radin who do a much better job than I could, because that's basically what he's dedicated his life to. That said, I'm a big fan of Dean Radin. I remember reading his book, The Conscious Universe, many years ago, and what he does is he does a statistical technique called meta-analysis, which is something that is very common in medical research. And the idea being that being able to make statements about the universe or the world, a cause and effect relationship, whether, this causes cancer or what have you, often relies on a large amount of data to be able to get a good picture of the world. The problem is any kind of a study, and again, this is true whether it's medical research or whether it's ESP research, is limited by funding. And so, or the availability of people with a particular disease, who to enroll in your study, for example. And so what statisticians have done, they've come up with this way of taking multiple studies that have been published and then averaging together their results to make it kind of artificially this large study. And this is a very accepted statistical method in research in medicine and psychology and other fields. And Dean Radin basically does this with literature on ESP. And the results of these meta-analyses, and I do talk about this a little bit in Mind Over Magick as well, concludes that when you average all these studies together, some with positive results, some with negative results, you do get a statistically significant, although pretty small, deviation from chance. It's like a percentage. I don't remember the exact amount off the top of my head, but it's not like this is going to guarantee you success or anything like that, but it's kind of like shifting the odds slightly in your favor. And I often think about a line from Mr. Spock from Star Trek saying that, chance favors a prepared mind. So to the extent to which, there may be a psychic component involved in this magic stuff, it doesn't necessarily guarantee you a result, but just it greases the wheels. And I think, if that's true, you're not going to get a result just by kind of sitting back passively and waiting for the universe to knock on your doorstep. I think the idea here is that if the odds are shifted slightly in your favor, you still need to be going out there and kind of advocating for yourself to the universe. It's for things to go your way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like somebody watching The Secret and then expecting everything to happen for them. Yeah, so I mentioned off air, I have OCD. I'm very familiar with ritual. This is anybody who has OCD does, whether it's organizing something, washing your hands a certain amount of times, or, some people count. There's like a whole different array of ritual associated with having OCD and stuff. I told you I've never gotten anything positive other than like to self-soothe or, satisfy my own mind temporarily or something like that. But do you think that, obviously we're talking about mind over magic here, mind as it relates to magic. Do you think it's the intention? Like that's what I kind of take away from when people talk about that. It's like the intention. Like if you put the intention behind something, your energy, whether it's creating art or whatever, there's something going into that otherwise wouldn't be there, but you're putting your focus and your time and your heart and your energy into it, as opposed to just, like you said, sitting back and like waiting for something good to happen or something.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there are certainly rituals that we engage in as human beings every day. I mean, we brush our teeth, we take showers, we commute to work, and these are things that we tend to do very automatically. We don't really have to give too much thought to them, and that's good. I mean, they think about this idea of decision fatigue. People just kind of wearing themselves out, thinking too much about what shirt am I going to wear today, and every little decision. And so, being able to go on autopilot for basic human functions is a good thing. But in terms of having a result, having a change, having an effect from a ritual, there does need to be an intention of some sort. There needs to be some mindfulness about it. And in Mind Over Magic, early on in the book, I talk about a big part of magic is establishing kind of a routine of doing a regular sort of practice of some kind. And that may be journaling. It may be doing something like some sort of a cleansing or a banishing every day, or what have you, or some sort of grounding and centering. And or another example I talk about is that there may be some sort of words you might say over a meal. In Christian traditions, it's like a blessing of the food, and the Thelemic tradition that Aleister Crowley created. It's not so much about blessing the food, but it's about pausing, saying, why am I eating this? To what end am I eating? It's to sustain myself to do this great work of, discovering my true will and, transform myself in accordance with that to become the best version of myself possible. And if you do that ritual and you don't really think about the words and you just say them automatically and then you eat kind of automatically, you're not gaining the effect of that ritual. I mean, I argue that ritual does involve mindful engagement with what you are doing. And while it's easy to go on autopilot with a lot of things in your life, magic is not one of those. You need to be plugged in and attending to it every time you do it, or you're not going to get the results or the effects.
Interesting. What was your hypothesis going into writing this book, Mind Over Magic? And did it change at all after you finished writing it through your research?
I don't know if I had like a hypothesis in like the experimental sense, but I think I just had this sense that over the years, I would be reading a paper and I would say, oh, hey, that kind of relates to this thing, this about psychology, about the psychology of magic. And while it wasn't specifically about magic, it's like, oh, okay, this relates in some way. And I just got to this point where I realized that while there may not be this overarching theory of the psychology of magic out there, in the experimental literature, there were pieces that did explain this. And so I kind of approach this more as a puzzle, to put together the pieces. So I kind of went through, the prevailing theories and research areas in psychology and, personality theory and social psychology, and started to think how, if at all, any of these relate to the psychology of magic, whether you're talking about, daily ritual, habit formation, for instance, mindfulness, being in the zone, cognitive dissonance, attitude change, and all of these things, and where these would plug into and inform practices that magicians go through. And then I just did this huge lit review where I pulled, like 1,300 articles, on these different topics, and kind of went through them and put together the narrative that's in this book. So it's not so much I had a theory, but I had an inkling that if we put all these pieces together, it would make a picture. And I didn't necessarily have a picture in mind when I started, but as I, again, sort of putting together the puzzle, the book just kind of took on a life of its own. And as I filled in the pieces, I kind of saw the picture take shape, which was, very exciting and gratifying for me. Since, again, I came into psychology looking for these answers, felt like I didn't find them in graduate school. But then, again, 30 years later, I've kind of filled in the picture for myself. So that was a very gratifying feeling.
I'm not, I've had people on where we've talked about magic, or people that are familiar with Aleister Crowley, or, some of the more esoteric people throughout, the different eras and things like that. When you do magic or like perform rituals or things like that, what are these people expecting, and do they expect to get something out of it? Because for me personally, the only thing I've ever experienced that was like, I don't want to say supernatural because it's not supernatural, but the only thing I've ever experienced in like a waking state that was completely transformative would be like a psychoactive compound or a psychedelic or something along those lines. I've meditated. I used to be a huge meditator, and sometimes I'd meditate for 2 hours, and you can get to some pretty deep states, but it's still people that claim it's the same. I don't agree with those people. So
yeah. What people expect, I think, depends on what they're doing. I think, again, the person who engages in the meditation practice, you can experience ecstatic states doing that. These ideas of, samadhi, the union with the Godhead sort of trance experiences. There's also research that shows that engaging in these sorts of yogic and meditation practices actually increases the brain volume and the neural connections in your brain. And the theory there is that this will in some ways protect against the effects of aging, because as you age, you lose brain matter. That's kind of a known phenomenon. So that if you basically bulk up your brain volume, as in older age, you will suffer the effects of, cognitive effects of aging to a lesser degree. And there is a chapter in Mind Over Magick about that. But otherwise, there's other rituals people might do, like a part of a daily practice might be some sort of grounding, kind of visualizing yourself, sinking into the earth, or, being a tree, growing into the sky and drawing in energy from the sun and from the earth, or the middle pillar exercise, which is kind of a similar thing, but just more Kabbalistic. And the intent of that is just kind of, again, grounding, settling in, feeling, whatever energy or whatever flowing through your body, and kind of feeling kind of, not distracted, but centered and empowered. But a banishing or a cleansing ceremony of your space, might have a different intention. It might, the intention there might be to kind of clear away distractions, to kind of purify your environment that you're going to do some kind of work again. One might do some sort of a consecration of a talisman, for instance. A talisman would be something, some object that you are trying to impress with an intention to bring something into your life. But that's going to, again, have a very different expectation from someone who is perhaps trying to invoke some deity or some spirit. Oftentimes people will invoke or summon into themselves like the quality of some god, goddess, spirit, whatever, saying, I could really use some more generosity in my life. I'm going to invoke the spirit of Jupiter to kind of help me identify with that sort of feeling. But that's, again, going to be very different from if you do evocation, which is to try to summon something to visible appearance before you. So again, the difference between, are you trying to bring some quality into yourself, or you're trying to interact with something out there in the world in front of you, or just doing some sort of like a astral vision or a vision quest of some sort. Kind of similar to meditation, but you're like, you could be meditating in a tarot card and let your mind take you on a journey somewhere, or you might literally astral project and leave your body and go on some kind of an adventure. And then what you are going to encounter oftentimes is really kind of in the spirit of adventure. You don't know what you're going to expect. It's investigation, and oftentimes people who pursue that will engage in kind of this process of reality checking, saying, is what I'm getting adding up? Is what, if I've encountered something that's talking to me, does what it look like match what it's telling me? If I ask for its name, does that name match? If I ask what's your favorite color, does it match, the entity that you're claiming to be, and so on. So I guess the summary of all that is that what you might expect from doing ritual really kind of depends on the kind of ritual that you're doing and what your intention is.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've talked a lot about like ancient cultures and civilizations on this show. When you look back at like ancient Sumer and ancient Egypt and stuff, there was a lot of magic and spells and things like that. How much do you think belief plays into whether you get a result or not? Like, meaning that, like, if you fully believe in what you're doing, will it yield a different result as opposed to somebody that's maybe more hesitant, or maybe doesn't believe it as much? I mean, I just think about like religion too. I remember when I started this podcast, I was kind of 8 years ago, kind of going through a spiritual awakening. And I was connecting a lot of dots, and things were romantic and fun, and there was good vibes flowing. And then you start to like read a lot more, and you start to realize, like, peel the veil and the layers back a little bit, and you start to realize, oh, there's, maybe there's not a whole lot to that. So how much does belief play into magic, and does it change the results?
I agree with you. I think belief is a critical piece of it. And before we talk about like the science of it, I've got a couple of anecdotal examples I can provide. I remember one time bumping into a person who was an avowed ceremonial magician, but his grimoire or working manual of magic was literally the Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. And he told me about how he went onto the astral plane and fought through all 666 levels of the abyss and blah, 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 but it was all D&D terminology. And again, I don't doubt that this person had experiences, but the experiences were framed by this belief in this system. Similarly, there's this very popular text called the Necronomicon. Now, this was a text that Lovecraft invented for his, Cthulhu mythos. It does not exist, and it was just this mystery text that you could call upon as the background for these ancient horrible beings that existed before time and outside our universe. But back in the 70s, someone put together a bunch of like Sumerian, Akkadian, Kabbalistic, Crowley stuff and came up with this mishmash and released it as a book called the Necronomicon. And it's a modern invention. It's not an actual text, even though there's this mythical story about how, it was given to the editor and all of that. But people in the intervening decades have picked up this book, used it, and sworn they've gotten results from it. And so I think the idea here is that, a lot of these practices at some point in history are made up, and it's through practicing and refining and belief that these things do work. Why, if you didn't believe in something, and you click your heels 3 times and say there's no place like home, but you don't believe it, why would you expect something to happen? And it's similar in psychological research. For instance, there's a study looking at like Joseph Campbell's hero archetype, that cycle of myth. And there's actually psychologists who've done studies where they looked at whether people saw themselves as the main character in their story of their life, or whether they just saw themselves as an NPC, a non-player character, and developing exercises to kind of cast yourself in your own small life, or not so small life, in terms of this, hero's journey. And people who do this have a better sense of self and psychological well-being and so on. The thing I would caution, though, about is that I think belief and credulity needs to be balanced with a good deal of inquiry, doubt, skepticism, verification. I think that this whole idea of truth, particularly in this area, is kind of a double-edged sword. And again, in Mind Over Magick, I talk about this, that skeptics will criticize practitioners or believers as being gullible, as susceptible, as believing in things uncritically. But there's similarly research on the flip side saying that people who are excessively skeptical are more inclined to miss information and not see patterns and reject information when it is in fact valid. And so I would advocate that you kind of find that middle ground, be open, but also verify. And again, a lot of that verify happens through your own experiences. Does something work for you or does it not? If it doesn't work for you, after a few tries, try something else.
Yeah. Do you think that there's this most of what we're talking about just to me feels like metaphysics, like just stuff we just don't really fully understand yet, whether it's philosophy of mind or, the nature of reality, consciousness, things like that. But do you think that, to your point, what you just said, that there is this thin sliver of could go kind of either way, and if you're open to it, it might work in your favor, but if you're closed off and let's say a dogmatic materialist scientist who's looking for the most empirical outcome might miss something that could inform on a deeper level or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I talk about in Mind Over Magick is my dissertation in psychology actually looked at the psychology of metaphysical beliefs. One of the things I took issue with when I was reviewing the literature at this time was that a lot of the studies that were being done on Psych 101 Psych 101, students. And, I was a Psych 101 student at one point, and I think other than myself, perhaps, there was only maybe a handful who had actually wrestled with these metaphysical questions. And so to be asking a classroom of 300, 18-year-olds what they think about karma or reincarnation or stuff, these are quite likely ideas I never really thought too much about, let alone actually engaged with in a meaningful way. And so I wanted to survey people who were actually practitioners of some sort. So I went to conferences and conventions and, camping events that were kind of geared toward, the pagan occult community, and talked to those people, and the people who were actually doing this stuff. And one of the things I was interested in was this idea of a transformative religious experience, this idea that you've had this, again, a peak experience. There's lots of terms for it, but there's that moment where everything in your life kind of shifts, this transformative thing where the way you see the world is forever changed and you're forever changed as a person. You mentioned, psychedelics earlier. A lot of people have that sort of reaction to their psychedelic experiences, like their view of the world is forever changed. And in that research that I did, I found that the best predictor of having this kind of a transformative religious experience, or spiritual experience, was that you were open to new experiences. So this idea that if you felt you had all the answers, and this applies not just to science, saying I'm a skeptic and science tells me everything I need to know, but also, refers to, your spirituality or religious beliefs too. If you're a person who says this is my holy book, or this is, what my preacher tells me, or this is what, the religious leader in my community tells me, and I don't need to think about it anymore because I've been giving the answers and that's it, you're not really going to be as open to an experience as people are saying, oh, I'm kind of curious to find out about the world, or to learn more about my faith or my beliefs. And it's that openness that's kind of the key to having these sorts of transformative experiences.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and to the point about the psychedelic stuff, I mean, if you go throughout history, most of the cultural, aside from like the people partying and just doing it, whatever, most of the cultural uses, you go to the Eleusinian mysteries. There's a lot of ritual associated with that. You go to South America, the Shipibo or the Watoto. These tribes in Amazon have these rituals with ayahuasca. The Native Americans, Path of Souls. You can go all over the world, and Soma, Homa, all over, and there's ritual associated with the use of these psychoactive compounds. So, and I mean, even the average Joe that I know that's using psychedelics, they might not think about it that way, but they have some level of ritual associated with the experience, setting, everything's got to be a certain way, that kind of a thing. So
yeah. And in the interest of fairness, I should say that the use of psychedelics in ritual is something that I really don't get into in this book, because again, that could be a whole other book in and of itself. And
you should write that one too.
well, again, there's other people out there for whom that is their passion, and I think that like I talked about Dean Radin earlier. He's the person to write about ESP research. There's other people like P.D. Newman and son, and so on, who could do a better job of talking about this than I. So again, this kind of the book I've written kind of sticks pretty close to kind of standard psychological theory, but it's just a real easy step into the ESP or some other related area. Rupert Sheldrake, who we mentioned earlier, all this stuff, people can easily integrate this into the bigger puzzle if they so choose.
Yeah, for sure. Shout out to PD, shout out to Chris Bennett, a couple people, connected on that topic that we've had on the show in the past. I consider PD a friend too. Shout out. As far as, let's talk about like flow states for a minute, or like, you know, integrating the stuff into kind of like practice and even like stage magic for that, like obviously we think of like sleight of hand and things like that. When you say magic, obviously your books with the K, and that can, obviously insinuate ritual. But what about like stage magic and performative magic, flow states, things like that?
I think stage magic or sleight of hand, that sort of practice, is something different from flow state, but there is definitely stuff that we can learn from the psychology of stage magic. There's actually a whole field of psychologists and magicians kind of collaborating to talk about the psychology, that is used in misdirection or these sort of forced choice tricks and things like that. There's one of the interesting things I get into is this idea of psychological priming. And there's a study where a magician takes somebody, on a walk through town. They go into a toy store and they're asked, pick out a toy. And they pick out the toy, and the magician pulls out a card and it says giraffe. And the person had picked out a toy giraffe. But what they talk about is the setup to this study is that along that path they walk to the toy store, there's various things. There might be a giraffe pictured on like a bus stop poster, or a picture of a giraffe, in chalk on, or some graffiti or something. And so they might pass various things along the way that feature a giraffe, and they don't point it out, but it's there kind of subliminally. And so it kind of prompts your mind to think along those lines. And so that when you get to that toy store, the person is more likely to gravitate toward this giraffe because they've been kind of psychologically primed to do so. And this idea of priming is something that also can be used in magical ritual, with a K. The idea that if you're going through some sort of a retirement or a period of preparation for some kind of a ritual work, that you are, in a sense, kind of priming yourself for the experience you're about to have. You're kind of meditating on and preparing yourself and psyching yourself up. And in that sense, I think we kind of get into this idea of a flow state, because that's generally defined as this sort of slippery and hard to get into state of mind where the thing that you're doing, while it may involve some technical skill, just flows effortlessly. And that can be whether you're playing sports or whether you're playing a musical instrument or so ever, but it just happens effortlessly. And it's just this like really calm Zen experience. And getting into that flow state is not something you just say, okay, here we go. And there are actually people who train athletes to get into flow states. And the training regimen for this looks remarkably like the sorts of preparation people do in ritual magic. It's like, get a diary, meditate, do these exercises, do these visualizations. And, it just knocked me out looking at these articles about here's how how these sports psychologists train athletes to get into the zone. I'm just like, that's exactly, literally exactly what magicians do. And so in that sense,
like manipulating kind of attention or perception kind of a thing.
Yeah. Or just, kind of, again, priming those expectations and practicing getting into that flow state. This idea that the more you do this, the easier it is to kind of enter that flow state. And sort of like priming or setting yourself up with like psychological cues, there's also to be said for some like the superstitions that people in sports engage in. Like, I've got to wear my magic underwear or my special socks or the special jersey, when I go out onto the field. That's true in a lot of other field, areas. Actors can go through the same sort of process of trying to get into the shoes, literally or figuratively, of the role that they're playing. in the book, I talk about how Isabella Rossellini, when she was doing table readings for Blue Velvet, even though, so again, you're not really acting out the roles physically, you're just kind of sitting around the table reading your part. But she talks about how she needed to have the nail polish on her fingers so that she could look at her hands and believe that she was that character. And so these sorts of cues, that we kind of train ourselves in, whether you're, again, athlete, actor, magician, can facilitate getting into this sort of flow state where things just work more effortlessly.
How do you personally distinguish between like psychological efficacy and of like ritual versus, let's say, like metaphysical claims? How do you parse that out?
Could you elaborate?
Just like the difference between how it affects somebody versus what they're claiming it's having an effect on them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't try to explain what the phenomenon is. I think that phenomenon is kind of an open question, and the book, starts with this idea that unusual experiences really are not that unusual, that most people, perhaps at some point or another in their lives, will have some sort of, WTF moment in their life, something they can't explain. Like, what is that? And yeah, I'm trained as a statistician, and in statistics, you never have a cut and dry yes or no. You have probably true or probably false, but there's always that chance that could be wrong. And so I'm kind of constitutionally used to living with a certain amount of uncertainty. And, so with a lot of the sorts of phenomena that people might experience doing ritual, I mean, if they are evoking something to visible appearance, for example, is a spirit or a deity or whatever literally appearing in the room in front of them? Or is this the idea of the third man phenomenon, or the sensed presence that we talk about in psychology, and nothing more than that? I just don't go there, because I think the end result is people do practice these practices and they experience things that transform them as individuals. And what that is that transforms them, to me, is not as important as the fact that they're experiencing transformation. So, again, I try not to dip my toe into the metaphysics, and I don't think the metaphysics is really something that psychology could answer anyway. So, again, I kind of leave that to the reader to kind of interpret for themselves, or to pursue, again, further studies in, Rupert Sheldrake, Dean Radin, and, all these other folks we're talking about, Chris Bennett, P.D. Newman, the related areas.
Awesome. I want to pivot a little bit here. I listened to you, I think you were reading one of your books, is it Panic in Detroit, about Aleister Crowley coming to Detroit and causing kind of a whole hoopla. Can you give us a little bit of a background on that? As somebody, I'm from the Detroit area and I love history and historical things that relate to the city. I think that would be a great little piece here.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who hails from Detroit myself, this period is especially fascinating to me. But what happened was, during World War I, Crowley wound up moving from England to the United States, living here for those 5 years. And at one point, toward the end of his stay, he wanted to publish another issue of his periodical, the Equinox, which is really like a book-length sort of publication. But he had kind of suspended doing that when he left the UK. And right about that time, some people from Detroit got in contact with them because there were antiquarian and used book dealers who were interested in occult and metaphysical topics, and there were also members of the Masonic fraternity, and they knew that Crowley was the head of this, or the English head of this organization called Ordo Templi Orientis, which was kind of a offshoot of Freemasonry, and they were interested in knowing more. So they brought Crowley to Detroit to on the offer of, hey, not only do I have this bookstore, but we can publish this book, the Equinox that you want to do, but we also want to know more about this OTO group. We might be interested in starting a branch here in the Motor City. And so Crowley saw an opportunity, came out, and he met with some of the local Mason folks and got the book published. But when it came time to forming the group, there was a lot of jockeying for position about who would be on the Supreme Grand Council and who would not be, and quarreling ensued. And then when Crowley's Equinox came out, there with the hymn to Pan and things like this, some people were like, "Oh my gosh, this is not at all what I imagined it would be," and things just kind of blew up. The people who had invested in the bookstore suddenly got cold feet about this investment in the book, and they wanted their money back. And the people who wanted to start this Supreme Grand Council started to get cold feet and backed out. And when this bookstore, the publishing company, had financial troubles and went bankrupt, the Masonic people who were involved tried to blame Crowley for it. And this is patently false, because the amount of debt that this company was under far, far, far exceeded the cost of printing the Equinox. But in the eyes of the press at that time, this was a juicy and salacious story. So it became the story of how Aleister Crowley tries to start this love cult in Detroit, and this obscene volume was shipped around the country, including to Hollywood, where it inspired drug-fueled orgies and things like this. And it was all wild. I mean, I can remember when I was first researching this, sitting at the Burton Historical Collection at the Detroit Public Library, going through microfilms of the Free Press or the news at that time, and this is front page news, and it just blew my mind thinking that this is like a moral panic, this hysteria. At this point, by the time this bookstore was having the bankruptcy and stuff, Crowley had already moved back to England. He was long gone, but people were still trying to vilify and blame him for these things because his book was too spooky for them.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think we mentioned off there that the Detroit Masonic Temple, I've seen some concerts there. It's a beautiful building. And I think that was built in mid to early 1920s, I believe.
Yeah, I think about 1924. So that building was actually built shortly after Crowley left the area.
Gotcha.
In fact, his kind of right hand man or field manager, Charles Stansfeld Jones, actually took his Blue Lodge Masonic initiations at the former Grand Lodge building in Detroit, which was again raised to make the new one, in the 1920s. But Jones took his initiations, around 1918, 1919.
Interesting. Yeah, and I know actually Jack White's mom used to be she used to work at the Masonic Temple, I think cleaning it or something, being a custodian, and he's the one that saved it, because I know that they were considering demolishing it or getting rid of it at some point. But
yeah, that was so cool. Yeah, because that's the problem with a lot of these Masonic temples around, is that they were built at a time when belonging to social clubs like the Masons was a thing that basically everybody did. And so they had these large memberships, and part of the membership is you're paying dues, and the dues help with the upkeep of the building. And in the years this idea over the decades, the idea of people belonging to groups has become less and less appealing. There's a book called Bowling Alone that deals with this phenomenon that like bowling leagues have kind of disappeared for the same reason. People don't do this the way they used to. And so now these Masonic buildings are, they still need new roofs, as the Masonic Temple did, and other sorts of maintenance. And, finding the money to do that is very hard. I remember a number of years ago, there was a Masonic Temple in Ferndale that was bought and turned into like a nightclub, because they just couldn't afford to upkeep the building anymore. So that's kind of the unfortunate reality that a lot of Masonic bodies face. Some of them may have like money and trust from the past, but it was really, really cool and very generous of Jack White to kind of save the Masonic Temple, because it's the largest Masonic temple in the world, I believe. It's got like over 1,000 rooms, and it's really quite a
like I said, I've
remarkable and one of a kind thing.
Yeah, I've seen concerts there. They have the Acacia room right there too. Yeah, I mean, my cousin who's a photographer, he said he went all throughout there taking pictures for some event or something. He said it's unbelievable, the architecture and everything. So
yeah, and they do tours. I haven't had the pleasure myself. I know a lot of people who have, and it's great. And I also have not had the pleasure of seeing a concert at the Masonic Hall, but my older sister I know has. I believe she saw the Rolling Stones there, actually.
Nice. Yeah, I'd have to look. I wonder if Jack White, in any capacity, whether it was White Stripes or before, has ever played a concert there. I wonder if that impacted, aside from his mom being connected to it and stuff, I wonder if that played a role into it. I want to ask you too, how does Detroit's like occult history fit into the broader American esoteric history, when we're talking about like the 20th century and Aleister Crowley and all these kind of movements and stuff like that? Is it kind of important? Is it not important? Did it just happen to be Detroit, or?
Well, at the time that Crowley came to Detroit, Detroit was basically the New York City of the Midwest. I mean, Chicago kind of replaced that, a little bit later, but Detroit was, basically the buzzing metropolis of, in the early 1910s or, turn of the century there, the turn of the 20th century. You had the auto industry and, just this great amount of, wealth and prosperity happening. And then you kind of see that transition happen with sort of the Crowley circle, because a lot of those people came to Detroit to support, the publication of this Equinox volume and also the establishment of the Supreme Grand Council. And when that kind of fell apart, a lot of these people wound up drifting to Chicago, which again was kind of up and coming. And it's, in Chicago, for instance, you do see, a lot of, not only do you see this occult work from Charles Stansfield Jones, who had been centered in Detroit and was giving talks in and around town, at the Rosebud Club and the Theosophical Society and things like that. Now he was like publishing things out of Chicago, and you had the New Thought movement kind of taking root. But Detroit has always been kind of an interesting place, during the late 1800s, early 1900s. There was this, sort of rogue splinter of the Masonic fraternity called the Egyptian Rite of Memphis and Mizraim that had a foothold here in Michigan, and one of its leaders, lived here and was, writing about that. So there's a lot of interesting, weird history about Detroit. One of my favorite factoids is the fact that the Fisher Mansion down on the riverfront was actually donated by the Fisher heiress to the Bhaktivedanta Center, and so it's now like a Hare Krishna temple, and they've tried to like restore it and preserve its historical nature, but they also have like nights where they do free vegetarian feasts and things like that. So it's kind of wild to go to this place where here's the secret boat launch where they used to illegally run liquor across the border to Canada, across the Detroit River. Now let's go upstairs and have our vegetarian feast.
Nice. Yeah, have you seen how they restored the old train station?
No, I haven't, but my brother-in-law, he used to work security there when they were doing that work. So it sounds amazing.
You should check it out. I mean, it's beautiful. They did an amazing job. What a great
Yeah.
building too. The architecture and everything.
Yeah. Another
Um,
thing about Detroit I'm reminded of is my sister, when she was in junior high school, actually interviewed and did a class project on Gundella the Green Witch, who was very famous in the Detroit area in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, we've definitely got our history there in Detroit and
nice.
roundabouts.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, I want to talk about Aleister Crowley a little bit too, aside from the Detroit stuff. You
Sure.
wrote a book called Perdurabo. Is that pronouncing it correctly?
Yes.
Um, is that basically like a biography or what? Because I haven't checked it out yet. I do want to check it out.
Yeah, Perdurabo is, subtitled The Life of Aleister Crowley, so it's a biography. Perdurabo is the motto that Crowley took when he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The idea is that everyone who initiated chose some sort of a motto to kind of express, again, their intention, as we were talking about earlier. What is your goal as an initiate or as a practicing magician? And, Perdurabo came from a biblical verse. Crowley's father was a preacher, so he was very well versed in his Bible. And Perdurabo is a Latin word that means "I shall endure to the end," and that was sort of Crowley's aspiration, and I think very much descriptive of what his life was like. And so I think it's a very apt title for the book, even though it might be a little bit of a mouthful to say. But he was someone who went out looking for spiritual truth, found his version of it in this channeled text called the Book of the Law, and like his preacher father before him, he spent his life trying to spread the word to anyone who would listen, and basically burned through the fortune that he inherited trying to do so, and kind of lived on a stipend, a trust fund from left over from his parents, and from support from his friends and followers in his later days. But at no point did he ever waver from his sense of purpose in trying to transmit what he thought was spiritual truth. And so this idea of "I will pursue," "I will endure to the end," um, really very much fits, the big life story of Aleister Crowley.
Interesting. Why do you think people considered him to be like, a long time ago, before I knew anything about any of this stuff? You hear the name, you hear, oh, he's dangerous or evil or something along those lines. Do you think it was just because it was, a counterculture movement or something that people just didn't understand? Like, why do you think he got that moniker or the people having that perception of him?
Well, one thing that Crowley was really notorious for was pushing against standard, societal norms, particularly like Victorian, you know, propriety and prudishness. He was, a sexually liberated person. He was, a queer person, and and he was also practicing spirituality that didn't fit into the category of Christian. And so the press just had a field day, claiming that he was trying to revive pagan religions, and was a bad influence. That people wanted to call him a devil worshiper, because of course anything that's not Christian can only be one other thing, and that's devil worship. There's no in between or no other category for some people. And so Crowley became a I don't know, popular figure to beat up on in the tabloids because it sold papers, and um, even his early biographers spared no punches, and kind of they befriending him while he was alive, and then while he was dead, doing him dirty, and talking about what a terrible person he was, and spreading in some cases misinformation, and in many ways this is what inspired me to write Perdurabo in the first place, is that a lot of what has been written and said about Crowley has been very sensational, untrue, misleading, etc. And I just wanted to tell the factual story. And whether you read, and if you read that book and you get to the end of it, whether you like him or loathe him is fine with me. I just feel like people should be able to make a decision based on their own judgment of the facts. Whereas most other biographers, the biographer was telling you what you should think about Crowley, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to say, here's the facts. You make up your own mind.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Like I said, this is kind of like a little out of my wheelhouse. It's kind of, all this stuff's kind of fringe, but at the same time, I come from a different view on a lot of this stuff. But so what was the connection? I did read, what was it called? Strange Angel about Jack Parsons.
Yes.
So what was that connection all about? Is that in Perdurabo too, or?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. I mean, it's obviously Strange Angel is a biography of Jack Parsons, who was one of the fathers of rocket science in the United States. And so I don't go into as much detail as this book that's all about Jack Parsons, but Jack Parsons does turn up, and the story there is that toward the end of Crowley's life, he was still head of this organization, OTO, or Ordo Templi Orientis, but the only group really active under him at that time was this group of folks in Los Angeles. And one of the members was Jack Parsons, who kind of, came into them through, there's an overlap. You can imagine, in a lot of communities, there's these, overlapping pancake stacks. And in those days, the sci-fi community and the occult community had a lot of overlapping membership. And Jack Parsons.
That's how I heard about all that too, was like through the UFO online community, because they're talking about, they're contacting entities and they're trying to create, portals and things.
Yeah, so it's just as true then as it is today that these Renaissance festival people, sci-fi people, occult people or whatever, they tend to fit into multiple categories, and so Jack Parsons got involved in this group through people in the OTO who are also part of the science fiction community, and this included a fellow by the name of Grady McMurtry, but also, interestingly enough, a sci-fi writer by the name of L. Ron Hubbard. So, which is a whole other story.
He's not famous at all.
Yeah, but and probably more than we can get into here. But Jack Parsons was a wild guy. He had kind of an intuitive understanding of how explosives work. I mean, he worked for like a company that packed explosives. And while he didn't have a lot of formal education or training in engineering, he kind of, just through his own experimentation, kind of developed a sense of these ideas of these combustible materials and how to channel that into rocketry, which was, again, science fiction at the time. But, he and his, the Suicide Club, as they were called, back at the university there, Stanford and Caltech, helped develop the first solid rocket fuel, jet assisted takeoff and things like that. And the stories are that Jack would sometimes recite Crowley's Hymn to Pan before rocket launches, kind of as his own ritual to ensure things went smoothly.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll have to check out Perdurabo and maybe go back and revisit Strange Angel as well.
The book is really cool. The TV show while it's good entertainment.
TV show? I didn't even.
Oh yeah, there were 2 seasons of called Strange Angel, so it took its name from the book, but it took a lot of liberties with the facts. So don't watch it like expecting the history of either the occult or of
so just don't watch it then. So
it's
none of the juicy stuff's in there then.
Oh, I mean, it's other juicy stuff that they make up, but there's things that happen out of sequence, and there's things that people that didn't exist, but it's kind of to serve the story moving along. So it's entertaining television, but if you really want the true story, read the book rather than watch the TV show. That would be my intent. But if you want entertainment, watch the TV show.
All right. Before we get to this segment, Mike's Mind Melters, is there anything else you want to, put out there about Mind Over Magick? It is, if you're listening to this, it's been available for a week. We're recording this on the 7th, which it's released today. Congratulations. But if you're listening, it'll already be out a week. So please, again, click the link at the bottom, pick up a copy. And is there an audio copy by chance too? Did you do the audiobook?
It's currently available as print and ebook.
Okay.
We are working on an audiobook, but I don't really have a date of when that will be available.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, go pick up your copy. Got the link down below. And again, congratulations on that. And if you'd be most gracious to enter Mike's Mind Melters, let's do this.
Okay. I'm ready. Melt my mind.
All right, Richard, I'm going to ask you 5 philosophical questions. Please just answer them the best that you can. Number 1, what is something you believe in that you know is probably wrong or illogical, but you are just not being honest with yourself?
Something that is wrong. Gosh, that's tough. I think maybe what I'll pose as that answer is the reason it's hard is that I like to think that being trained as a scientist and kind of being in my head sort of person, I've always, admired, Mr. Spock. I am more Vulcan than human. That I've like to think of myself as being capable, being more detached and analytic and objective about things. And I suppose being human, I'm probably not as detached and as objective as I like to think that I am. And that's potentially a blind spot for me.
I like it. Cognitive bias. We all have them. All right. Number 2. Do you think there is an objective purpose for humanity? And if so, what?
That's a tough one. I mean, me personally, I really kind of like a lot of the Eastern ideas that the universe is all a bunch of interconnected stuff. And, I don't want to get like woo about,
like an Indra's net or like a Alan Watts kind of a...
Yeah. And, again, not getting really woo about like, the physics of things, but, even most matter is more space than it is particles, and, but there's particles connect, between everything in the universe. And so this idea that everything is kind of connected in one thing and that we perceive differences because of our incarnation on this planet, but that sense of separation is an illusion, and there's a state of mind or a state of progress and evolution, associated with, burning off your karma and becoming enlightened and kind of entering the ocean of reality. And in that standpoint, the goal here is for all of us to kind of get to the ocean, as it were, kind of like the baby turtles, hatch trying to get to the ocean before the birds eat us or something.
75 seagulls come in and eat them all.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
So
I like
to
that.
get there and to, help other people get there as well.
I like that. Number 3. Do you think humans are special or separate from the rest of nature? If yes, give me your best example or explanation of why.
No, I think we are part of nature. Humans certainly perceive themselves as special. I think kind of the history of science has been kind of also the history of taking humanity down a notch. The idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. Oh no, we revolve around the sun. The sun is the center. Oh, it's not the center of the universe. It's the center of our solar system, which is just part of a galaxy, which is one of many galaxies in the universe, and so on. Oh, humans are unique. Now we're descended from apes. Oh, but humans are the only ones who build tools. It's like, no, lots of other animals build tools as well.
Yeah, I mean, that argument you could say like recursive tool making, but even that there's proto tool making, so it's not like that's a completely original thing.
Yeah, I remember I used to have a Chihuahua who would, at the most inopportune times, like when company was over and having dinner, this Chihuahua would fold his bed and have like a burrito and have sex with it. But I would say he's making a tool. He is not using the bed for what it's intended for. He has turned it into something else, and that is tool making.
Good point. Good point. Number 4. What do you think happens when we die?
No idea. I mean, for this, I think I will kind of punt to something that Crowley writes in a ceremony of his called the Gnostic Mass, where he has these sections talking about birth, life, marriage, and so on. And there's a section on death, and then there's a little reading that has to do with what he calls the end. And he talks about may you be granted the accomplishment of your true will, whether it be incarnation on this planet or another, and various other options. The idea basically being that we don't know what happens, but we hope that whatever you hope for yourself at the end of all this, we hope you get that. And I find that kind of intriguing. A, it's just acknowledging we don't know, but B, it almost kind of implies, and this again getting kind of out there, but we're kind of we're in the mind melt area, so let's melt some minds here. It kind of makes you wonder if, again, reality is a little bit more plastic than we think it is, and that, just as our beliefs can shape the results that we get doing magic, do our expectations of what happens after we die, is what happens shaped by what we think is going to happen? I don't know.
I like it. No, I like that. That's good.
Yeah, so some person might reincarnate, some people might go to another planet, some people might be absorbed into the infinite,
Yeah, I mean, if there's infinite possibilities, why wouldn't there be infinite possibilities when you also die too, right? I mean,
yeah.
All right, last one. I think I'm sticking with this one. This the 5th question since I've started.
My mind is still inside my ears. That's good.
I think this one's sticking. But so this is my favorite quote: 2 possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe or we are not. Both are equally terrifying. Arthur C. Clarke. So, that being said, do you think there is life elsewhere in the universe, or do you think we are alone?
I think it's almost certainly a statistical certainty that there's other life in the galaxy. I mean, whether it's, human, whether it's evolved or what have you, we don't know. But, just you just look at the odds. There's an equation out there for calculating the odds, and while people can debate the values of these various parameters in the equation, it's almost certain that in this massive universe of ours there is, and particularly now that we have the capability to not only identify stars, but we can identify planets revolving around those stars and get a measure of the composition of their atmosphere, how close or far they are from that star, and actually identify Earth-like planets is just super exciting, to think about. And that's also based on the idea that we're talking about, carbon-based life, that there might not be some other sort of thing out there. So, yeah, I'm pretty confident that there's other things, other forms of life out there in this vast and infinite universe of ours.
Yeah, I thought you might subconsciously. I was thinking he's going to take that his statistical background and apply it here. The Drake equation. I think we need like an updated Drake equation. Maybe AI can really dial it in. So every time we discover something new, it's like a evolving equation each time something comes into the picture.
Kind of like the doomsday clock, right?
Yeah,
Except
yeah.
Intelligent life.
That'd be cool. So listen, man, I really appreciate you answering all those. I know some of them, like that first one really throws people off because you're basically saying what's something that you believe in that's probably wrong. I don't think most people aren't willing to admit. Maybe if you were like,
we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, but maybe if you're super religious or something like that, and you really did, deep down, you thought, oh, maybe there's nothing to this, whatever religion it is or whatever, something like that I could see. But no, I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you coming on. This was totally kind of, like I said, like outside my wheelhouse. I know a lot of stuff like adjacent to these topics. So I love kind of putting myself in, these kind of positions where I'm learning something new, and you definitely shed some light on some stuff that I had no idea about. And I look forward to checking out Perdurabo and all your future stuff. And Mind Over Magick is available right now. Check it out. Links down below. Is there anything else you want to say or plug before we wrap this up?
I would just say thank you so much for the opportunity to come on this show and talk with you. It's always a pleasure for me too to have this kind of a chance, because having written a lot of really heady sort of historical, sort of esoteric stuff, Mind Over Magick is a little bit more geared to a wider readership than just the sort of really Crowley-centric sort of stuff. And it's good practice to kind of talk about this stuff in a more jargon-free and approachable sort of way. So yes, please do pick up Mind Over Magick. And again, as you mentioned, if you're interested in my other work, the Crowley stuff, Perdurabo, the Life of Aleister Crowley is the biography. I mentioned earlier the book I wrote about his interaction with agnosticism, and that's a book called Friendship and Doubt. And also earlier this year, also from my publisher, Inner Traditions, there was they released a critical edition of Aleister Crowley's book, The Sword of Song, which is his first really magical book that I edited, annotated, and added a lot of explanatory footnotes to. So those are all places or ways you can follow my work, and I'm also online through my website. You can also find me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky. So come look for me. Let me know how you like the book.
Awesome. Sounds good. And like I said, this episode will be released. If you're listening to this, it is October 14th. We're speaking from the past. No, but please check out Mind Over Magick and all the other wonderful books this gentleman has written. And I would like to, if I can get a chance to get Perdurabo in here sometime in the next few months or something, maybe I can have you back on in the future and we can really just talk about Crowley and Crowley's stuff.
That'd be great.
But yeah, listen, man, I really appreciate your time, and you seem to be really well researched and read into these topics, and I love talking with people that really put a lot of time into stuff, because it shows. So I just want to say I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you so much.
All right, everybody. Well, we're going to end this episode the same way we end all episodes, which is We love everybody. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time. Peace. If you would like to support Mind Escape, there's many ways you can do it, but the best way to do it is to click the LinkTree link down below. I have everything from merch to our Patreon page. Our Patreon, by the way, I archived a lot of the Mind Escape 1.0 episodes on there. There is still some available on our YouTube channel and our Spotify and Apple Podcast. However, like I said, if you're looking for a specific older episode, it might be on our Patreon, which has been archived, and it's $2 a month. And there's also exclusive content on there as well that was never released to any other platform. So please go check that out. You can also check out our documentary that Maurice and I made a few years ago called As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT. That is available on there as well. There's also a director's cut. Please click the subscribe button and follow us. And if you're listening on an audio platform like Spotify, we do have video on Spotify as well. And please leave us a nice review. We would really appreciate that.